Okay,
There's
bottom line, we want, it proposes to align state laws with federal laws,
Yes.
which would actually have been the intent of the Enabling Act
Yeah.
originally. Okay,
Right,
thank you.
probably, yes. Okay, that's 119. 120 is the last of the propositions that was referred by the legislature. How are we doing on time?
15 minutes.
Proposition 120 would amend the state constitution to remove a statement that was put in at statehood time where the state waived all right to federal lands within the boundaries of the state of Arizona. And instead it would put in a kind of a declaration that the state is ultimately sovereign over all the lands within the boundaries of the state of Arizona, with the exception of specific lands deeded to the federal government, Indian reservations, and it seemed like there was one other. Anyway, there would be certain lands that are still not the state's, but generally speaking, this is kind of a statement that the state would eliminate this waiver that was in our Constitution and would now kind of be declaring that the state is sovereign over all the other lands within the state of Arizona's boundaries. And the only thing I think I can guarantee you that will happen if this one passes is that there will be lawsuits for as long as I live and most of my grandchildren if this passes. And I cannot answer, for example, I do not believe that this would immediately or ultimately transfer the Grand Canyon National Park over to the state. I don't think that would happen even if this passes. Every individual act that the state may try to exercise if this were passed would probably be challenged. And those kinds of questions would be ultimately worked out over years and years and years in the court system. There was a question in the back.
What was the rationale? What was the legislative rationale for offering this proposition?
I think the legislative rationale is a frustration that the federal government continues to hold on to large proportions of Arizona's land. In doing so, they do not pay any property tax. In most states, especially back east, almost all of the land is held by someone privately, and therefore somebody's paying property tax. There's an in lieu payment that has been in discussion where if the federal government were paying kind of like a property tax on all the lands that it continues to own in Arizona and some of the western states, all of the budgets in Arizona at various different levels would be better off, and on and on and on, but the federal government never pays those. And so that's a gross oversimplification. I apologize, but I think the rationale was that kind of comes from the frustration that large portions, I think well over half of the state, of the lands within the boundaries of the state of Arizona are still owned by the federal government. And some may think that's a good thing, but collectively they thought they wanted to kind of begin to try to change that.
Did that include reservations?
No, it excludes reservations, it excludes,
Regarding the current ownership of federal land in Arizona, does that include that 50% include the reservations?
no. I believe, I'm going to get it wrong, so for those on the camera, of the 100% of property that is in Arizona, I believe about 13% of it is owned by private individuals or private somebody's. About 25% is reservation land. About might be about 10% was that state trust land, and all the rest is federal. So even if you had the private land, the Indian reservations, and the state trust lands, you still don't get over 50%. I think all the rest of the state is still owned by the Fed, or controlled by the federal government. Yes?
You mentioned that one of the possible legislative rationales was how, comparing it to back east, a lot of that land is held privately. Would it be maybe in the state's plans, if there were to be a passing of this law, to sell a a lot of these things to private investors? That seems like it would follow rationale-wise.
It might be, that's not stated in any way in this proposition, but it basically just declares Arizona's sovereignty over much, much more of the land that's within our boundaries, excluding reservations and specific lands that have been deeded to the federal government. Whether future legislatures or the people would choose to sell off that land is hard to know. Okay. We could spend all day speculating on that one. Proposition,
Propositions left?
just two.
Two, yeah.
We're now to Proposition 121, which, as I stated, it's a 100, so it's still a proposed change to the Constitution. But this is the one that was initiated by a private group. The previous 7 that we've been talking about were referred by the legislature. Proposition 121 would change how we conduct our elections, specifically our primary elections in Arizona. And there would no longer be party primaries where each party gets to select its nominee, and then all of the nominees run in the general election. Under Proposition 121, we would go to what some call an open primary, or a direct primary, or sometimes called a top 2. That actually uses the phrase top 2 a couple times in the proposition. But essentially what would happen if this passes is that the parties would not run separate primaries. There would be one big open primary, and all of the candidates, irrespective of their party affiliation, would run together in one big primary. And then all of the voters, irrespective of their party affiliation, would all vote in one big primary. And the top 2 vote getters, irrespective of party, would move on for every seat available in the general election. As you might imagine, that could create a scenario where the top 2 vote getters are from the same party, depending on how many candidates from each party run in the open primary. And that has happened in some of the other states that have used this. In the 31st Congressional District of California in June. That's a district that is fairly heavily Democrat registration. So they have typically sent a Democrat congressperson to represent that district in Washington. The first, California passed this open primary idea a couple of years ago. This was the first time they used it. And in that particular district, even though it was about, I think, like 60% Democrat and 40% Republican, 4 Democrats ran in the primary, 2 Republicans ran in the primary. And so the 4 Democrats split up to 60% and each got about 15% of the vote. The 2 Republicans split up to 40% and got 20% of the vote. And the only 2 that will be on the ballot in the general election are the 2 Republicans. Now that could happen in reverse, but that's one of the things that people have expressed some concern about this. On the other hand, the people that support this have used as some of their reasoning the fact that independents currently in Arizona, if you want to run as an independent, you don't have a primary that you get to run in. You have to collect 5 or 6 times as many signatures as the party candidates have to collect. And you do get to go then directly to the general primary, or to the general election. And the party folks would argue, well, I still have to win my party primary. But those are the kinds of differences and inequities, I guess, or perceived inequities that the people that are trying to solve here. And I think there's a stated intent that they also think that if everyone has to run big primary, you can't, as a Republican, just kind of run to the right and only get your very, very conservative ones to support you in your primary. And the Democrat, they think that maybe sometimes they run to the left. And the people that win the primaries are kind of from the opposite, from the extremes of the party. And those that have said that this is a good idea are saying this will kind of bring everybody to the middle. And all the voters in Arizona will decide whether they agree with one side or the other, but that's essentially what 121 does is we would have party primaries. You'd have one big open primary and everybody would run together, and the top 2 vote getters, no matter what their party affiliation is, go on to the general. All right? The last one. Oh, question.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah. Question in the back
So
there?
it says that it doesn't apply to the presidential election and then any other special election.
Yes, thank you.
Can you clarify for those that are
This putting everybody in the same primary would not apply to the U.S. presidential election. It would also not apply to elections that don't identify what the People's Party affiliation is in the first place. Like most of our city council races in Arizona, it's a nonpartisan, or school boards, or things like that. So if elections in Arizona are already conducted on a nonpartisan basis, this would not apply to them because they already kind of use this already. If you know that in a city council election, everybody runs in a primary and the top 2 for each available seat move on to the general unless somebody gets more than 50% in the primary. So this would kind of make the rest of our elections that normally do have a party affiliation next to their name. State legislature, statewide offices, county supervisors, most of your county races are done with a party affiliation. But this would not apply to the U.S. presidential election. We would still have the parties selecting a nominee in Arizona, and they would go on to represent that party in the general.
What about like recall elections? If there was,
It doesn't say anything about recalls except that if this passes, there will be a significant rewrite required of all of our election laws because most of our election laws are kind of based on the party system. And so if a Republican senator is recalled from office, then when you have an election, or not recall, if a person dies, if a Republican member of the legislature dies, the appointment has to be of a person from the same party. Whether that would still be the case, there would be all kinds of new laws or laws that we currently have that are kind of based on party affiliation that would have to be changed in order to comply with this new one, which says that the only election that is done by a party primary is the presidential election. Now this does still allow or provide for the candidates, even in this combined open top 2 primary, they will still be able to identify their political party. In fact, it even creates a system where the candidate would have up to 20 characters next to their name to put what they kind of self-declare their party to be. And it wouldn't be limited to just Republican, Democrat, Green, Libertarian. You could put voteforken.com.
As chief elections officer, would you say this makes the elections process more complicated or less complicated?
It would be a very significant change from the way we do it now, and probably more complicated, especially if people start putting on their conservative Democrat or endorsed by so-and-so, or vote, you know, your website right next to your name on the ballot, or my opponent's a child molester, or who knows what somebody might want to fit into that 20 characters.
How do you feel like the recent Citizens United decision and the influx of out-of-state money would affect this if it was one big pool?
It's hard to predict how the Citizens United would affect this, but I think it's fair to say that it's already, I think, frustrating for people when they have primaries where you attract 7, 8, 9, 10 candidates, and it's hard to know which of that many is worth your vote. Most under the current system, if you're a member of a party, you know that the people that are running in that are supposedly of your same party. This is going to combine everybody in together, and it may create scenarios where the best way to get elected is to create other people to run in the primary and take votes away from your opponents, or find somebody that's weak to run and support them in the primary so that they're one of the top two with you, and then you can easily beat them in the general, or who knows what kind of complications. But that can almost happen already.
Got bad news, I'm afraid.
We're about out of time.
It's 1 o'clock, actually.
Okay, well, then we got to do 204. 204, again, this is a 200 number, so it's a proposed change to the state law. And this was proposed by a group that, as the background, you may recall that about 2.5 years ago, the voters in Arizona, as part of fixing the state budget crisis that we were in at the time, the governor and legislature put on the ballot at a special election a temporary 1-cent sales tax for education and healthcare and public safety. 2/3 was supposed to go to education, and 1/3 is supposed to go to public safety and healthcare. But that was for only 3 years. And that 1-cent temporary tax expires May 31st of 2013. Proposition 204 would create a new tax, happens to be the same amount as the temporary one, 1 cent per dollar, that would begin the day after the old one expires. But this one would be permanent, would not be a temporary, it would be a permanent 1 cent per dollar tax. And there's a series of funds that Proposition 204 sets up that intends to essentially put about 80% of the money into education and about 20% into infrastructure and public infrastructure projects, land buildings, roads, whatever. Now some will say, well, this is just continuing the same tax, so it's not a tax increase, but the other tax was intended and will expire on May 31st. The new tax starts on June the 1st, and it's the same rate as the other one, so it will feel as though, if this passes, it will feel as though the state sales tax stays the same. But because the old temporary tax could only go till March 31st, this is a new tax. This is a new 1 cent tax that will start on June 1st of 2013 and go on permanently.
And the only way to get rid of it would be to do another amendment.
Right. The only way to change or get rid of it would be for the voters to vote again at a statewide general election to get rid of it. And it does a couple of other things. It prohibits the legislature from spending less on K-12 education and universities than what they spent this year or next year, whichever is the higher, I think it says. It also has a thing in there that says the future legislatures cannot change our sales tax base if doing so reduces the amount of money that goes to education. So for example, when I say sales tax base, I mean the types of things that we apply a sales tax on. So for example, we apply sales tax on retail products, if you buy something in stores, food, restaurants, construction, some is on utility bills, and on and on and on. Basically, this says that if a future legislature ever wanted to change or eliminate one of those things on the sales tax, if they wanted to take the sales tax off of food someday, they could only do that if they went and found something else in the economy that they put in its place that would collect the same amount of money plus 6% more for education. So it's kind of you can never do anything less than what you're doing now, and you have to actually do more if you want to change anything. So it does some things that I think people ought to be very careful in looking at, because it'll be difficult for future legislatures to do anything like that. Yes, sir.
I heard an argument that it's not 1%, turns out to be 18%. Where did they get the 18% number?
Okay, he's read an article that this is not a 1%, it's an 18%. The reason that some say that this is an 18% increase, when the old 1% tax goes away on May 31st, the state sales tax will go essentially from about 6.6% back to the old 5.6%.